All right, welcome aboard the very last session of GIC. So thank you for coming, more people than I expected. I know it's been a long few days, but I appreciate you coming, and hopefully you'll find this really interesting. So this is a talk about what I call allegorical distance, which don't worry, I'll explain it later. I'm not going to explain it right now. But the whole focus of this is about what we do and how we think when we create cultures within our games, and whether our games are dealing with fantasy world cultures, fictional cultures that we want to create to serve our narrative, or if we're dealing with real world cultures that are based on the real world, including real world locations. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And this is pretty much relevant in my view to every single game that's ever been made, because every game that gets made is a world that gets built. Now, it doesn't have to be a massive RPG and all of that kind of stuff, but it might be. Some games, like the whole Assassin's Creed series, an interesting mix of real-world location and history, and yet they thread through it a fictional narrative about the Templars and the Assassins and all that kind of thing. Of course, you have fictional worlds like Horizon Zero Dawn, but it is the future, so it's science fiction. It takes place in our universe, but in the future. As well as, of course, we've got the Witcher series with its particular world building. And you'll notice with all of these, there's artifacts, there's objects, there's architecture, there's costumes, there's all of these things that are being represented in the game. Things like Halo, also real history, well, it's not real history, it's real future history several centuries from now. But again, it has to take place in the real world. It deals with real world physics, real world, politics and things like that. And of course, you've got games like Baldur's Gate 3, which is a complete fictional world, and you can do all kinds of interesting things. But there are certain rules for things you can do and create in a fictional world versus how you treat subjects in a real world. And that's what we're going to talk about. So my background, I'm a geographer, and I've been doing culturalization work on games for 31 years. I started in 1993, Flight Sim 5.0, back when I was at Microsoft. I've since worked on, I just started my 288th game last week. I work across a lot of different companies, but essentially what I've been doing as a geographer in this industry is exploring this interaction between what is real, which is the geography outside these walls, and then it's what is represented. So how do we decide to represent places, people, cultures within our games? And then more importantly, or most importantly to me, is how it's perceived. How do our players perceive these worlds that we create, and our intentions behind the creations that we make? And originally I am from Los Angeles, but of course that's Los Santos from Grand Theft Auto 5, not Los Angeles, but close enough as a representation of my origin. These are some of the games I've worked on over the years. Just a lot of big AAA stuff. I've worked on everything you can imagine, from two-person indie games to card and board games, and to lots of AAA stuff. I'm actually just finished up Veilguard just a few months ago, and just finishing up Indiana Jones at this moment, even though it releases only 5 weeks from now, but we won't talk about that. So what is culturalization? What exactly is that process? So effectively, I work with all these amazing teams who are creating these game worlds, and I try and help them navigate how is that game world and their creative vision going to be compatible with these local worldviews into which they're going to sell their game. Or hopefully sell their game. And so what I do is I look at the content and I try and help preserve at all costs the creative vision of what they intend, but also see, is there anything that might need to be changed to culturalize to make sure the game is going to work in a specific country, culture, region, whatever it might be. So it's an interesting kind of gene splicing exercise. We want to combine and preserve the best element of the creative vision, but see if there's anything we might need to change, do a little DNA tweaks to make sure it works in certain markets. So I'm working in this zone where I'm looking at content assets, and I'm looking for things that are either compatible or incompatible with the local market. And a lot of times, as you'll see from examples I'll show, these things often are very surgical. It's like one specific thing. It's not like the entire game concept, although that has happened a couple of times in my career. So when we're looking at world building, the way that I approach it, especially from a culturalization perspective, is that you have two key things you're looking to do. You have a narrative, a story you want to tell. So you have narrative goals, and then you have experience goals. So how does the player engage with that story? And to me, that gives you what I call the realization goals. How much world do you need to build in order to satisfy the story and satisfy the player's experience within that story? And so I frame it this way because a lot of games I've worked on, frankly, especially at the AAA level, they tend to overbuild. They make way more than they really need in order to tell the story and have a great player experience. And that's one reason why you see games cost tens of millions, or if not hundreds of millions of dollars to make. Now, when I'm talking about real world and I'm talking about fiction world, obviously it's not that black and white, because many, many games fall somewhere in a zone in between. So we have this zone of overlap. So like a lot of games are set in the real world, but they have a fictional overlay, like Assassin's Creed was a good example. Or Grand Theft Auto is a world that I call hyper-real, where you kind of have, it's not the real world, it's just one step outside the real world, but everyone knows it's Los Angeles. It's no secret. But by the fact they made it a fictional Los Angeles lets the developer kind of do all kinds of cool things that maybe people in Los Angeles may not appreciate if it was actually the real city. And of course, you have that spectrum that goes all the way to worlds that are completely fictional. They have nothing to do with our world or our universe in any way. Now, this is what I call a realization matrix, because it's not just about real world and fictional, it's also about past and future. Now, I decided to put some game franchises and movies and books into this matrix. You can debate whether or not I put it there correctly. So you can see, like, what's interesting to me is that most fantasy worlds in games and even in literature tend to be based on European medieval history. They pretty much, you think about the style of all of those games that are listed there, and like Game of Thrones there, that are listed, they're all kind of similar because they're based on European and medieval history. And so not a lot of games, not a lot of movies, not a lot of properties have deviated from that when they're thinking about a fantasy world. And it's interesting, you know, like I put Dune up there, and it's in the far future, just like Foundation. If you've read Asimov's Foundation series, they're in the very far future, you know, tens of thousands of years in our human future. But there's some elements to them that are so bizarre and different. Like Dune to me almost feels like complete fiction, because the world they live in just has almost nothing to do other than them being actually human. Whereas Foundation is more rooted in actual, you know, the actual universe we live in, because part of the whole Foundation story is about trying to find the origin of humans, which is Earth. So so it's also important to just think about, it's also a past and future consideration, not just whether or not it's fictional or real world. Now, when we're doing cultural representation, and I'm going to keep using RW for real world and FW for fictional world, we do have some specific goals that we typically strive for on most of the games that take place in one or the other. So when we're making a real world game, usually we're trying to replicate things because we want to be authentic, right? We want to make something, we want to make it look like it does in the real world. So replication and accuracy are often two of the key driving goals in the world building. Whereas in a fictional world, it's almost the opposite. It's like about distinction and imagination. We want something to be different. We want it to be something nobody's ever seen before. It's not something you can go visit here on this planet. So it's something really cool. It has a sense of escapism, which is also the cultural perception that comes when players play these games. If they're playing a real world game, they want that feeling of realism. They want that authenticity. You know, just like in a fictional world, they want escapism and discovery. They want to see things. I mean, like, to me, Breath of the Wild, there's many good examples, but Breath of the Wild did a phenomenal job about allowing discovery within the world of Hyrule, the way they made the world open world. And not just that, but the fact that almost anywhere you go, you encounter something interesting somewhere in the landscape. And just like real world games with authenticity, like the Indiana Jones game that I've been working on for over 3 years, he visits real world locations in that game. So I've had archaeologists working with me and people who are local to help make sure that everything is exactly accurate to the way it's supposed to be in those locales, even down to the hieroglyphs on the walls. So let's talk a little bit more about real world games and some of the distinct issues with those. So these are some of the issues that come up a lot in my work, and I'm going to just say what the issues are, but I will explain them. So augmentation, accuracy, the interpretation, and then what I would say appropriateness. So augmentation is basically where we take a real world place and we change it to some degree, but not enough to make it look very different. So on the Ninja Gaiden series, They liked their world to be hyperreal. They wanted you to know that this is Moscow, but they did not want it to be Moscow, which is kind of interesting because it's like, no, we don't want it exactly the same, but we want everyone to know that it's Moscow. Kind of like what they did with Los Santos in Grand Theft Auto. So this is the original Kremlin clock tower on the right, and it may be a little bit subtle, but we did make some cosmetic changes to the clock tower in the version on the left that showed up in the game. It's almost like, I know a lot of people are like, but what did they change? It looks pretty much the same. It is mostly the same, but they added like different layers. Like this middle layer here does not exist on the real clock tower. This extension doesn't either. So they kind of made it a little bit different. But there's a huge danger in this because obviously if you do this to a structure that's highly revered, has cultural significance, especially religious significance, that can be a huge problem. So you have to be really careful if you're actually going to be modifying a real world object. Accuracy is another thing we have to be careful about. So this is a game I worked on where it was a whole zombie attack game, and I won't name it because I don't want to call it out, but this was the president of the United States that was in the game. And this character also had kind of a southern drawl. And, you know, to me, when I saw this character and heard him speaking and everything, it immediately reminded me of former President Clinton. And that's exactly who they were modeling this character off of. Now, you might think, well, why is that a big deal? It's not really a big deal except for what they made him say. So in the game, he actually says at one point, we need to enact the final solution. He actually uses the phrase, the final solution. If you don't know what that means, that's from Nazi Germany. That's an infamous phrase that Hitler used related to the extermination of the Jews. So it's a phrase you do not use in pretty much any dialogue these days. And so to have the president saying, you know, we're going to enact the final solution was really problematic. And so they almost made it like we're making Bill Clinton say this, which then, you know, could even be a legal problem if his estate or, you know, well, he's still alive. But if he decided, you know what, I don't like that you made me say that, even though the president's name was not Bill Clinton, but they, you know, they might be able to take action. Interpretation is another thing that comes up a lot. And so I've worked on a lot of historical games like Age of Empires and Civilization and all that. And we often have times where the history we put in the game is seen differently by that market that it affects. So in this scenario you're seeing here, you see Japan on the right in blue, and you see the Korean Peninsula in red on the left. And so in this scenario, this was during the Middle Ages, Korea was called the Chosun Empire. And so Japan invaded the Chosun Empire and almost took it over. So the developer said, that's a great battle to put in the game because you're going to play as the Chosun trying to stop this massive Japanese invasion. So they put it in the game because they said, yeah, this would be great. They put it in the game releases in South Korea, and it was instantly banned by the Korean government. You might, why? Why was it banned? Well, the Ministry of Information of South Korea said that this historical scenario never happened, like ever. In their history books, they did not have a massive invasion by Japan. So what are we supposed to do? I mean, this is a time when Microsoft was trying to grow its games business. It was pre-Xbox still. We knew from market research that South Korea is an extremely important gaming market, and they also love RTS games like Age of Empires. So we basically did the only thing we knew we could do, which was make a special patch only for Korean players. So now we changed history. So the Koreans are invading Japan instead of the other way around, which never happened. And as you can imagine, there was a huge debate on the development team about the ethics of this. We are blatantly serving up government propaganda in order to sell this game in the Korean market. But unfortunately, that is the price of entering a lot of markets today. I can't tell you how many companies, film, television, games, make these changes. They go bend over backwards for the Chinese government to get their games sold in China. And they even cross out their own values in order to do that because they want to seek the very lucrative Chinese market. And that's a moral decision that you have to make as a game developer. But this is one of those things that can be problematic with real world scenarios, is how the different cultures may interpret what you're including in your game. There's also the issue of appropriateness, like in Hitman 2, where they took the main action of the game into the Golden Temple in Amritsar, India, which is the center of the Sikh faith. And not only did they have the action inside that sacred site, they had the main character killing Sikhs inside that site. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of people in the Sikh community were really pissed off about it. They're like, why pick on us? What did we do to you? That's kind of the response that you would often hear. So yeah, that was one of those things where a lot of religious sites are often used in games, churches, synagogues, mosques, and they get bombed, they get destroyed. And a lot of this happened with Resistance Fall of Man, where the Church of England got really angry because the Manchester Cathedral, which was in the game, got damaged in the game, and the church was not happy with that. So let's talk a little bit about fictional world issues. So the main issues we deal with in the fictional world are emulation, generalization, cultural evidence, and then, of course, cultural or allegorical distance. So again, I will step through these things. So emulation is basically, which I see a lot in games that are based in fictional worlds. We are inspired by the real world. When we enter the creative process, whether we're artists or writers or whoever we are drawing upon our own personal experience. We're drawing on the things we see in books and Wikipedia and our own travels. There's so many cool things in the world to be inspired by. So, but that emulation that we do, we say, I want this thing to look like that from this culture, but I don't want it to be from that culture. Well, that happened in the game Jade Empire, where we had this elephant demon, and the original appearance of the elephant demon looked much closer like this, which is the Hindu god Ganesha. And Ganesha is a very positive, benevolent god who is very revered among people who practice Hinduism. So to turn that particular god into an evil character is pretty problematic. It's not something that they would want to see. So you can see what we did is we actually took off one set of the arms, so it only has two arms, and we took off. It used to have a much more elaborate headdress and other items it was wearing, and so we kind of toned it down, made it a little more simple. So it wasn't so obvious that this might be trying to emulate Ganesha. So we have to be really careful about that kind of thing. Generalization is a problem as well. So oftentimes what we will do is make assumptions, and I'll get back to this later on another point. We kind of assume that certain groups of things are the same. So we generalize. So for example, in the game Smite, which is a MOBA game, you've got a generalization of the different pantheons, the different groups of gods that exist, like the Norse gods, the Greek gods, and the Egyptian gods. Now, those three groups are not worshipped by very many people anymore. There are some that still worship those groups of gods. But then they decided to also put in the game the pantheon of Hindu gods, which are worshipped by about 1.2 billion people around the world. And so they instantly now are basically targeting an active faith and putting them into the game. And a lot of people from the Hindu faith were really upset because their deities, their gods, are appearing in a game like this where they fight against the Egyptians and the Norse and the Greek gods in a way that they just didn't think was very appropriate. Unfortunately, the developer just kind of brushed it off. They didn't care. They're like, we're not going to change it. So there was a lot of jokes around this game when it first came out. People said, why don't you just get it over with and you just throw in Jesus, Muhammad, and Moses and just make it a religious warfare game. But I'm glad they didn't do that. But so we have to be careful about just assuming the way a culture might view its belief systems or its the cultural things that are important to it. Cultural evidence is another really big important thing, which I see a lot. This happens a lot in games I work on. And what I mean by that is that when we build our environments, we often just throw objects into the environment. That's what we call backfilling the game with culture. So like let's say you have, it doesn't matter if it's like a complex RPG or just a really simple mobile game. You want to put objects in the game to kind of make it feel like it belongs to that particular culture within your game. It could be just simple like little flags or banners or symbols or costume design of the characters or something. In this case, this game, which I may or not remember, it was called Pocket God. And Pocket God, the whole point of this game was basically to torture these people and kill them in creative ways. So for example, you can make the volcano explode and the lava would melt them. You could dangle them over the water and sharks would eat them. You could flick them in the sky and you'd watch them fall and go splat on the ground. Now, there was a particular cultural group in the Pacific Ocean who was really pissed off about this, and because Polynesian groups in general, for two reasons. One was the depiction of the indigenous people, because it's a pretty outdated little depiction with a top knot. I mean, this is the kind of thing you'd see 100 years ago, not today. So the way they're depicted, they were not happy with. But more importantly, what you see there on that right side of the island is an object. It's a piece of cultural evidence that exists only on one place on Earth, and that's Easter Island. So by using that one specific piece of cultural evidence, you have now made this game about a specific culture. So you can understand why people who live on Easter Island or who are associated with Easter Island would be pissed off, because like, why are you picking on us? What did we do to deserve this kind of treatment? So that's why in a later version of the game, the developers swapped out the Moai for their own little idol, although they did not address any of the issues that were raised about the representation of the indigenous people. But this kind of thing happens so many times where I see artists and others just throw things into the environment without really thinking, what am I putting in here? Does it have a role? Does it have a purpose? There are some shared issues, culturalization issues between real world and fictional world. There is something that I call logical consistency. So that's thinking about, does everything in the environment, is everything in the game have a reason to be there? Is it logically consistent with the narrative and the experience goals? If it's just thrown in there randomly with no big reason, then you might want to rethink, does it really need to be there? Managing the non-linguistic assets can be challenging, especially if you're doing different versions, which relates to product versioning by language and locale. Because sometimes in games, especially the larger games I work on, we will frequently have this character design is for the West, that character design is for the MENA region. This character design is for East Asia, this one is for Latin America. And that's often because it might be for good reasons, what we call proactive culturalization, where we're trying to have an avatar or have something that resonates more deeply with a specific culture. It's not always a negative thing. And then finally, the discoverability issues is often something we have to think about, because I've seen a lot of things in games that I've worked on, but it's a matter of, can the player even see it? Do they even know it's there? I mean, I found some things, for example, in Rise of the Tomb Raider, where it was in a place in the game environment where a player would never see it because they never had access to like that side of the building. And yet I found it because some artist put it in there, and I guess it was a joke or something. It was like they put some occultic, like satanic symbol. I'm like, why? I mean, I don't understand. What if they someday decide to let players go on that side? Well, now you've got to fix that. So let's talk about allegory. So allegory, and that's kind of what I've alluded to earlier, allegory is usually a fictional narrative that conveys a non-obvious meaning. Allegory is not just about story, though. It could also be about a character. For example, when you had the Eloy and the characters in Horizon Zero Dawn, they're emulating indigenous people, and they're emulating like Native American culture, even though they're not supposed to be specifically Native American. So the meaning of the allegory, it can exist on multiple levels, and basically it's how the viewer is going to interpret that. How they interpret it depends on how they interact with the medium and what you intend, like how deeply do you intend for them to understand. And I'll discuss it a little more here. Now, I don't know how many people have watched the original Star Trek show from 60 years ago, or have watched the original Twilight Zone. The reason I call these out is because these shows were masters of allegory, and they had to be, because back in those days, in the 1960s, they could not talk about certain topics on television. The censors would just say no. They could not talk about racism. They could not talk about the Cold War. They could not talk about any of these things because, television was just supposed to put smiles on your face. It was like the happy drug that you watch every night with your family dinner. But this is, you think about the time when these shows came out. This was during the raging 60s, the late 60s in the United States, where you had race riots and all kinds of issues. Martin Luther King, all these other issues were going on in the 60s. It was a time of turmoil, social and cultural turmoil in the United States. And so these shows desperately wanted to say something about it, but they couldn't. So what they did is they had to make stories that kind of were about these issues, but they would hide it. They would wrap it in an allegory. So like Star Trek became really good at this. So like they had episodes, for example, about the dangers of blind patriotism. And they even threw in the American flag in there in one episode. They had episodes about racism. But in this case, the racism was demonstrated by people who hated each other because they were black and white on the, quote, wrong side of their face. But it was clearly talking about the race issues that were going on that everybody was seeing in the news every single day, but they couldn't talk about it, but they did it this way, in a very effective way. This episode was about the dangers of weapons of mass destruction and basically the futility of nuclear war, but they couldn't talk about that either, so they had to put it on some fictional planet somewhere in the galaxy. And even Next Generation, they continued this tradition and actually won several awards for some of their shows. Like this show was where they put Data on Trial, was all about slavery. It was essentially discussing the issue of slavery and the moral rightness of or wrongness of slavery. And so, you know, these are deep issues. These are like really serious cultural, societal issues. But this is the way they decided to address it, by taking the issue and wrapping it in a fictional allegory. And so allegorical distance then is that if you decide, for example, to say, I want to make a state in my game about whatever, you can choose whatever topic. It doesn't have to be a geopolitical event happening now. It could be anything you want. Like I want to discuss immigration in my game, but I don't really want to make it obvious. So basically, allegorical distance is the amount of effort it takes for a player to perceive that allegory. So how deeply do they have to look? How much effort do they have to make to understand that your intention was to have a message in your game? Whether it's this character represents that particular real world group, or this storyline in my game represents this particular historical event. And so that's basically what allegorical distance is, thinking about how much effort the player is going to need in order to discern your intentional meaning, if you have one. So basically we have your real world inspiration, which is again where a lot of creative work starts, and we have the game world implementation. So let's say, for example, you have a fictional world. You say, I'm going to create a culture that looks something like the Arabs in the desert, the Bedouin people, because on my planet it's a desert planet. Because I can tell you, every game that has had a fictional desert environment, all of the people look like Bedouin, like all the time. You know, I mean, even Dune did it, except Dune had still suits at least. But still, so allegorical distance is how much difference there is between the real world inspiration that you're leveraging and the game world implementation with the character design, the environments. It could be anything that's in the gaming environment. And don't worry, I do have examples. So let's talk about small allegorical distance. I already alluded to this earlier when I talked about Grand Theft Auto, but it's a really good example. So Grand Theft Auto 5 is a great example of a very short allegorical distance. When they created this game, it was very intentional that they were making this Los Angeles. They knew it. We all knew it. It was very obvious. They include some of the exact same architecture, but because they made it Los Santos so that they could kind of play around with LA in a way that they may not with the real place, that's a very short distance. It takes no effort almost to discern that, yeah, this game is about LA, even though it's not truly LA. So that's kind of an easy one. How about moderate distance is what we did in Dragon Age. So in Dragon Age, going back to the very first Dragon Age game, is that the Dalish elves, or one of the character groups that are in the game, the Dalish elves were specifically designed to be a commentary on immigration in the United States. So you had the team mostly sitting in Edmonton, Canada, looking to the south, seeing like a lot of the turmoil around, especially Hispanic immigration into the United States across the southern border, and the way that the people are treated when they come into the United States, which is usually not very well at all. And so they wanted to make sure that was something that was obvious. And so what they did was they took the elves of all races in fantasy, because the elves in most fantasy works are like these elevated, lofty, immortal beings who are like near perfect, like in Tolkien and some other works, and they took them down to like a very low level. They made them like an untouchable caste within the world of Dragon Age, where people don't like them, they don't like being around them, when they don't like interacting with them, they don't even try to understand these elves, who are basically trying to reclaim their homeland. And so essentially it's not as obvious that was the meaning, and yet that was very explicitly the meaning. That was the intention when the narrative was created, was to make that part of the story. And by taking the elves of all the races and making them the subject of this, they kind of felt that kind of emphasized it even more, because it's such a huge contrast to other fantasy works. And some players did pick up on this. You know, we look at blogs, we look at commentaries, look at Reddit, and some players eventually started to see, I think I see something here, especially players who are from an immigration background. I know some of my Hispanic friends who come from immigrant parents who came into the U.S., they totally saw this because that's part of their life experience, whereas other people didn't see it as much. And then we have large allegorical distance, where it's a lot tougher for people to discern. And this is also a good case of unintentional allegory, because what I'm about to describe was not intentional at all, and yet it set up an allegory that was pretty problematic. So this took place in Halo 2. I worked on the original games way back when. I don't know, for those who have not played Halo, I'm going to have to set it up really quick for you. You have an alien group called the Covenant. It's made up of different alien races, and it's run by 3 prophets, and that's what they're called, prophets. So there's like prophet of regret, prophet of truth, and what's the other one? I forget. Whatever. Prophets. So they're prophets. And the Covenant is a quasi-religious group, because they're trying to go on what they call the Great Path, which is started when they activate these massive halo rings, which are these alien structures that hardly anyone knows about. There's 7 of them spread around the galaxy. So what the Covenant wants to do, they want to activate the halo rings that puts them on the religious great path. And what the halo rings do is they happen to destroy all sentient life in all the galaxy. So the Covenant, religious group, run by prophets, they want to turn on the rings, weapon of mass destruction, kill all life, and they're done. Now, who's trying to stop them? A super soldier with an American accent named Master Chief. And now, so you've got one of the prophets named the Prophet of Truth. Now, that's often used synonym for Muhammad. And I decided, you know what, that's defensible, because you can argue, defensively, that Prophet of Truth could be applied to any religious figure. So I said, that's okay. I don't care about Prophet of Truth. What I do care about is this character. This was a Covenant character who was introduced in Halo 2, whose original name was Dervish. Now, Dervish is a title straight out of Sufi Islam. So now you've got the Dervish who from Sufi Islam serving a Prophet of Truth, who's a religious group going to activate WMD, kill all life in the galaxy, and an American super soldier is trying to stop them. And to make this even better, this is going to be the first major game title released by Microsoft after 9/11. So I saw this and I'm like, this is not an allegory we want people to see. We absolutely do not want them to perceive that this is the whole setup. I even tested this with some of my colleagues in the Middle East within Microsoft. I didn't really tell them anything other than to send them the scenario and said, do you have any thoughts about this? And at least half of them said, I see a revenge fantasy about the United States against Islam for 9/11. I'm like, thank you. That's exactly what I thought you would say. So we had to change this. I felt like at all costs, we have to change this. So to me, the way to break the allegory, to create more allegorical distance, was to not use Dervish. Because like I said, you can justify Prophet of Truth, and everything else that I described about the Covenant, Master Chief, that had already been put out in the first game. So everyone already knew the lore of the first game. So that wasn't a secret. The key is that you've got this Dervish character who is now trying to help the Covenant make this happen. So I said, if you just change Dervish to something else, then I think that breaks the allegory and we can defend all of our other creative choices. And so eventually, oops, sorry, go back. Oh, okay. That didn't pop up for some reason. Eventually, we changed the character's name to Arbiter. So this character is called the Arbiter in Halo. It's been the Arbiter ever since. And frankly, I thought that was a much better name for the character than Dervish for what this character does in the narrative. But yeah, it took a long time to change it because there's a lot of political issues with Bungie having to change this that I won't go into. But anyway, so this is a very large allegorical distance. This is not the kind of thing most people are going to pick up on, except unless it's very specific to your personal and cultural experience, which is oftentimes, like I said, some people did pick up on it, but that's because I actually showed it to them. They didn't find it by just playing the game. So this is something we have to be really careful about. So some of the key challenges we have in allegorical design are, one is cultural appropriation, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about, and the other is what I call cultural equivalency. So cultural appropriation is essentially when we portray a dominant group that's using cultural elements from a non-dominant group. It often tends to be indigenous groups, indigenous groups in North America, in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. They typically are the ones whose content is being leveraged by a dominant group. And so oftentimes that can be viewed as being exploitative or, actually showing a stereotype of a specific culture. So for example, you've got some characters that have appeared in games where, like these ones, the one in the bottom center and the one on the left, they're using Maori tattoos from the Maori people of New Zealand. And the Maori have become like a really cool culture to use in a lot of games in recent years, because they do have a fascinating culture. And they have a lot of interesting designs like the Tomoko face tattoo and the arm tattoos and other elements. But these people are not Maori. And so therefore, from a Maori perspective, they should not be wearing these tattoos because it's not appropriate from their cultural perspective. Just like the Caucasian women wearing sort of indigenous-like gear, and you don't see their full costume, but if you did, they look basically like they're dressed like Native Americans. And so some people might have an issue with that because in the context of the game, they were not indigenous people. Just like the character on the right here from Apex, she's wearing designs that are from the Native Americans who live in the northwest area of North America, which is kind of where I live. We have other characters show up too, where again, we have a character who is not Maori, who is wearing Maori outfits and clothing, and even this character Eloy in Horizon Zero Dawn got a lot of backlash from Native Americans in North America because they said her outfit is just a little too close. It's like it actually borrowed specifically some designs from specific Native American groups, and that's where they feel that crossed a line. They're not saying you can't dress like that in some way, but you don't just copy the design. So again, there was no allegorical distance in the team borrowing those designs. But at the same time, some people were also arguing that, yeah, but she's white, so she can't be indigenous. But obviously that's not true either. The Sami people in northern Scandinavia are Caucasian, and they are indigenous people, which is actually one of the struggles of the Sami people, is that people don't recognize them as indigenous because they look Caucasian. So that's another misunderstanding by some people. So even in Dune, there was a little bit of backlash. I mean, even though if you've read the books and you understand the context in which Frank Herbert wrote these books, it is based on Middle Eastern, basically Middle Eastern culture and mythology and other aspects. But some people felt the film copied it a little too close, even though honestly, like the language Chakobsa that they speak in Dune was modeled after, Frank Herbert imagined it to be like a future version of Arabic, of some kind of version of Arabic. So some people say this is cultural appropriation, but but that is exactly what's in the book. So you can go back to the 60s and complain to a deceased Frank Herbert that he shouldn't have done that, but it's kind of too late. Also, cultural appropriation versus appreciation is important to point out too, because cultural appropriation, again, is something we hear a lot, where, again, it's about dishonoring or demeaning or misrepresenting a culture by oftentimes using their artifacts out of context, whereas appreciation is the opposite, where we're trying to honor or elevate that culture in a way, or empowering them in some way in our game. You can either do that in a fictional world or you can do that in a real world setting. But the difference can be very subtle, and it's highly context dependent. It's not just simple to say that's appropriation, that's appreciation. I can tell you right now, I deal with so many cultural appropriation issues or supposed cultural appropriation issues in so many games. And oftentimes when a company comes to me and says, yeah, somebody's saying that we've culturally appropriated something, 80% of the time, the person complaining is a white person in the US. They're the ones complaining that it's cultural appropriation. And when I go to the different groups, because I'm connected with indigenous groups all over the world, if I go, for example, to the Maori context that I have and say, hey, someone says this is cultural appropriation, what do you think? And the first reaction almost always from the local group is like, oh my God, we're in the game. That's awesome. We're in the game. Because we're usually completely forgotten. The second reaction is, but they didn't do it right, or they could have done it better. So they should have asked us first. So it's like, I'm glad we're in there, but they should have asked, which I think is a natural reaction. And the dangers, of course, when you have mostly white people in the US, stepping up saying this is cultural appropriation, they also don't realize that what they're exhibiting is white saviorism, which on some levels is the justification for colonialism. But I don't think they understand that when they complain on behalf of a culture that is not theirs, they're actually doing something that in some ways is almost worse. So obviously seeking guidance from these groups is extremely important. And I can discuss that later, but there are examples though of cultural appreciation that work really well. Like I worked on Temple Run, Temple Run 2, where they were getting interest in the game. They were seeing more increased users in Mexico. So they said, you know what we're going to do? It's like for the holiday of Dia de los Muertos, which is coming up, on November 2nd, for that Day of the Dead holiday in Mexico, we're going to do a special skin for the game. So we're going to change the avatars. We're going to make them look appropriately dressed and their correct ethnicity. We're going to put elements in the environment that reflect the holiday. And so we did this, and the sales for the game just shot through the roof when this came out in Mexico. And it was so successful, they decided to do another one for the holy holiday, the Festival of Colors, in India, and saw the same very positive response, because this is also something that we call proactive culturalization, where you're actually making the changes, but for a very specific positive reason, to basically make your game resonate even more with a specific group. And I did a little bit of consulting on Never Alone as well, which if you have not seen this game, I highly recommend this game. I still consider it to be one of the best examples of cultural appreciation in a game, where this entire game was made in direct partnership with the tribal groups in northern Canada, because this is their culture. Everything in this game is their culture. The representation of the language, the clothing they wear, the buildings they live in, everything was done with their approval. So the team who was doing the development, who were primarily based in Seattle, they were doing it basically, they said, we are just shepherds of their culture, because we've been hired to basically make the game, but nothing was done without the indigenous group's approval, which to me, that is the most perfect way to do it. That also is a huge investment to take that step, but I'm glad this game was successful, and now they're actually working on a sequel right now, but with a different culture. So it's not with the culture in Canada. The last thing I'm going to mention is about cultural equivalency, which is this is also a huge danger we have to be careful about when we're creating our worlds, is we often kind of indiscriminately combine or merge two or more cultures together. Like we say, I love that thing from that culture and that thing from that culture, so I'm just going to put them together because I think that's cool. But the problem is that can often give a sense that you just think everybody's the same, and the cultures are just, well, they're all just the same culture anyway. So for example, on Jade Empire, we had this problem when we started making the game, because what I loved about Jade Empire was that this was a medieval fantasy game, but it was expressly going to be made on Asian culture, not European medieval culture. So the whole game was designed to reflect Asian medieval culture, but what's Asia? Which Asia? So four locales were used as the basis for this: Japan, South Korea, China, and India. As I I showed you the elephant version earlier. So these were the 4 areas from which inspiration were going to be taken to create the world of Jade Empire. It had a very heavy Chinese influence, but there was even a decision at one point, we wanted to have them speaking an Asian language, but which one would you choose? If you pick Chinese, that's going to instantly isolate those who are in Japan or Korea, because one thing that's very complicated about this is that there's a very complex and sensitive history between Korea, Japan, and China, that you step into that, you can be in a lot of trouble for how you show the different cultures, including their distant past. So that's where we had to be extremely careful about how we combine the elements in a way that made sense. So rather than kind of make it one homogeneous world where it's kind of everyone's the same in a way, we decided within the fantasy world there's areas that are kind of more Korean-like, more Japanese-like over there, more Chinese-like over here. So then at least there's a little more distinction in the cultural. So we didn't really get into the problem of directly combining cultural elements from like Korea and Japan, for example, which could be really problematic. So we have to be careful about this. But the thing that started this is the idea from the beginning of the project that there was sort of that idea of cultural equivalency where we're just going to take stuff from each one and kind of mix it around in a bowl and then throw it into our world and just, there it is. It's Asian culture. But it's like, it's not that easy. You really have to think very carefully about where you're going to draw your inspiration from. So to summarize the process then, let's say you have a world concept that was derived from your real world inspiration and your imagination. You say, I've got a great idea for a game. And then you start that core world building process. And essentially this is when the culturalization process begins. Most of the games I work on, I'm brought in very early, at the very beginning. I look at the draft script, the concept art, all of the basic world building elements, because then I can help guide them very easily at the beginning on things that may or may not work, versus waiting till later in production when it gets extremely expensive or time cost to change something. If you find out months later, oh, we should not use that character design. So allegorical distance is something we think about right away. Like, are there intended meanings in the designs? Are there intended meanings in the story? How are we going to represent those? Or do we want to make it obvious? Do we want to make it more hidden? What's our distance issue? This is where we also start doing our cultural research and consultation, because we want to avoid cultural appropriation and equivalency and whatnot. So we create assets, of course, we implement assets, and we're still thinking about these issues as we do that. And of course, we create the world that we want to create and iterate on that. But culturalization process basically goes from top to bottom, from end to end. Because, there's even issues I deal with after release sometimes, because sometimes we do our very best work, we feel very confident, we put the game out into the world, and then somebody still has a problem with it. And now that somebody is like, well, is it 3 people or is it 30,000 people? And if it's 30,000 people, then we didn't do our job. There's something that we did not see. So the last thing I'm going to mention here then is the power of intentional creation. So when we build these in-game cultures, every decision you make should be conscious. It really should. It should be deliberate and intentional, even down to what is that symbol? Why is it there? Why is that banner there? Why does that character look like that? That kind of stuff should be really intentional. It should not be too random. So that random backfilling that I mentioned earlier, the cultural evidence issue, really needs to be watched, because that's a very high-risk activity. And that's often why cultural representation goes wrong, because people are just kind of throwing things in there. And oftentimes, I know you're on a schedule, and it's like, we got to get this done. So we just got to fill the world with stuff. But it needs to be, again, very thoughtful. And so be mindful of your allegorical goals. Make sure that, and a lot of times we're not, when we're thinking about this, but you need to really kind of sit back and think, am I embedding some kind of meaning that I want to convey to the player through the story or the world or some other element? And then also closely manage the creation of cultural evidence and seek that input and validation from cultural groups, which honestly is something you can do at any level. You don't have to be a big AAA company to do that. These groups are out there on the internet. I reach out to them personally. Oftentimes the only thing they may want is like, can you give us credit at least in the game for helping you out? Sometimes it will be a paid consultation if you're doing something that's much more involved. But oftentimes just acknowledging that you're reaching out for their help is a huge step, because they're not used to that, honestly. So that's my talk. I think we have a little bit of time for questions. My website's being wonky right now, so if you want to add me on LinkedIn and ask questions later, feel free to do so. So thank you.